And I would like to welcome our next speaker, Kenzie Woodbridge. She works at the British Columbia Institute of Technology as a system analyst, web developer, dog strangler, and a community manager. She has a passion for communication, continuous iterative improvement, and for systemic solutions to systemic problems. Kenzie will talk about long-term documentation maintenance, critically necessary, deeply underappreciated. Kenzie, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm here to talk to you today about documentation because that's all I talk about to anyone ever, but in particular about the maintenance of that documentation over the long term. So first about me, my name is Kenzie, my pronouns are they and them. I am a senior systems analyst at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. We're a polytechnic. We teach all sorts of things from nursing to construction to environmental topics and so on. And I work in IT services. I am the knowledge manager and I am a user trainer and advocate as well. I attend a lot of meetings and I doodle in meetings because it helps me to pay attention and stay present in the meeting. And so a lot of my notes end up as words and phrases surrounded by complicated doodles, the effect of which I've somewhat replicated for you in these slides here. So that's me. The other thing you should know about me, and this is probably obvious, is that I am but one person. I am one strongly opinionated person, and everything that is in this talk is just this one strongly opinionated person's opinion, but I hope it has some use to you. Also, I will have undoubtedly missed something, and if you think, hey, yeah, but also, you know, I invite you to come and ask about it in the Q&A or come and talk to me about it afterwards, or hit me up on Twitter. You can see my Twitter handle is on most of the slides there. So feel free to ask me about it. I'd love to talk more about this. This is what I want to talk about with everyone, basically. So we all have a dream, right? And the dream is the documentation, that it will be great, right? And it is great. It will solve all of our problems. I mean, maybe. This isn't completely untrue. When you need it and you find the piece of documentation that solves your problem, it is great. But the documentation is only great when it is current, accurate, and relevant. And sometimes it isn't, which is actually the problem, right? Now, before I get too far into it, this is the problem we're going to try and solve. Theoretically. So I'm just going to define my terms though, because I know we all probably actually have a different idea in mind when we hear the word documentation. So here's my favorite definition. It's the life-changing magic of actually writing things down. But for today's talk, when I say documentation, I actually mean a very broad, all-inclusive kind of version of documentation. I'm talking about developer documentation, user documentation, code comments, release notes, all the things, all of it. I'm talking about all of it, broad definition. Likewise, what is long-term maintenance? Well, it's all the things we can do to keep our documentation accurate, relevant, and current over the long term. So this is the part where I have to tell you something very hard, and it doesn't please me to make you unhappy, so we'll do it as quickly as we can. Technology won't save us. Now, I know that we as tech people, we are constantly vulnerable to this idea. There will be a tool or a program or a script and it will solve all of our problems, but it just won't. Unfortunately, technological solutions can help. They are very, very important, but when it comes down to maintenance, it still always comes back to people. I'm so sorry. So here's the plan for what I'm going to talk about. I've already done the introductions and the definitions part. I've just crushed your hopes and dreams. Okay, good, so we can cross that off. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just sort of establish what criteria I will be using when I'm evaluating whether something is or isn't a good or useful strategy. Okay, so here we go. in order for something to be a good documentation maintenance strategy, it has to work for the people who are using it. And let's be clear, it has to work for those people. You know, it might seem very obvious, but I mean, really, the people that you have, the actual people, because they are who you have. It can't work for a better version of those people who have more time to devote to it, who have a different skill set, or who simply try harder, because there's no trying harder and there's no better version. These are the people you have. It has to work for them, okay? It also has to actually do the thing it's supposed to do. It has to ensure your documentation remains accurate, relevant, and current over time. That's very obvious, but if it doesn't do that, it's not a good strategy. This next one actually ties back to the first one as well. In order for it to be a good strategy, it has to be self-sustaining. It has to encourage its own use over time. And what that means will be different depending on the people that you have, because some people will be more attracted to certain options than others. And so they'll work for those contributors when it wouldn't work for different contributors. So it should want to make people want to keep using it because it pays them an immediate benefit as well as a long-term benefit. It also needs to fit all of your budgets, and those vary too. So it needs to fit the budget of money. It can't cost more than you have. It has to fit time that people have available to do the work. It has to fit in the amount of attention that anyone is willing to pay to the documentation, and it can't impact your performance budget because it's documentation. It's in support of the product. It can't, you know, be more important, take it over. It has to fit all of these budgets. And finally, it should be forward thinking. It should be able to scale as needed, right? Because if you have a strategy and it works at the small scale, but it will not work at a large scale, then unless you do not expect it to ever get big, you have a problem, because by the time you get to the large scale, you just have a mess. And digging yourself out is going to be a lot harder than it should be. And this is at least sometimes preventable. So those are the criteria I'm going to use. I've made these little icons and I'm going to mark those down for each of the strategies. So, you know, you can look back at it later if you want. You will have access to these slides. I'll share those. That's fine. You can look at them, share them around. It's all good. I'm on a mission to improve long-term documentation. So maintenance. So that's the thing. Please share them wherever you like. There will be a link at the end. So next, we're going to talk about what are the actual strategies and practices themselves, okay? So I'm actually going to start with practices that support documentation maintenance that aren't even like maintenance strategies themselves. They're just sort of, if you have these practices in place, it'll make maintenance a lot easier for you. So the first one I want to talk about is self-documenting code. Now, as we all know, this is a debate that people have been having on the internet since the internet. And I've apparently decided that you need to hear my thoughts on the matter, which, you know, is a thing. So what is self-documented code for anyone who isn't familiar with the term? Well, what it means in the most basic sense is that when you're writing your code, you're writing it in a way that is human readable. So someone unfamiliar with your code base can see by your variable naming and your function naming and things like this, what everything is intended to do. So it's not just what does variable I actually do here and that sort of thing. Every variable is readable, every function name is readable, and all those sorts of things. There's more to it than that. That's the basics. So self-documenting code, well, what are the pros to this approach as regards maintenance? It does make your code base more maintainable over time, which makes it easier to maintain your documentation as well. It's easier for people to go in and look at things and figure out where they work if they can actually just see it without having to interpret it and follow things around the code to figure it out. On a practical matter, it's a lot easier to search for a variable or a function across your code base if it has a more descriptive name than if you're just using single letters, things like that. It's more maintainable when you can actually understand what every piece is. It will save future developer time as well. In my experience, it inspires a great deal of enthusiasm for the people who are really into their self-documenting code. They love to talk about it. They're proud of it. So it is self-sustaining in that way. It attracts use for that kind of developer because it's all right there in the code. When you change the code, your so-called documentation, and I'm tipping my hand a little there, is also changed. So outdated info will be very unlikely in the system. But there are some cons or weaknesses. It's not actually a thing, right? Like, we call it self-documenting code, but if it is documentation of a kind, and my definition of documentation is broad, so sure, it is, but it's not complete. It's not documentation that is usable by more than the people who are looking at the code, which is a very small proportion of the people who are using it, likely. And it doesn't pull the bigger story together. Just because you know what a variable is being used for, or what a function will supposedly do, while that makes it easier to figure out how it interacts with other things, it doesn't necessarily document all of that for you. It doesn't tell you what the impact will be of changing something here. It doesn't tell you what the intent was. It doesn't tell you all the things that other kinds of documentation can tell you. Because it doesn't have a larger holistic view of what's going on with your documentation overall, it can be hard to identify gaps or duplications. As I said, it's inaccessible to end users, and it has limited reusability. So then some of you would be saying, okay, fine, well, you do that, but also you comment things well, right? And okay, so that can help to fill some of the gaps I just mentioned. Again, you still have some of those problems, however, and in particular, because both those things rely on individual humans to follow your commenting standards every single time consistently. The quality of that can be variable, because even the most excellent individual humans don't necessarily do that when they're busy or rushed or distracted. And finally, when you don't know the code well at all, or paradoxically, when you know it too well, you might not even understand how to write the kind of comments that other people need. For example, here's some clearly labeled functions and code comments, and they don't really add any of that information that I was talking about before. It doesn't like add anything. And this is a joke, obviously, but this is also a thing that we've all seen in reality. So none of that critique is to suggest you shouldn't do these and other things to make your code more understandable and easier to navigate and document. In fact, rather than get bogged down in the debate, let's just say we should write good code. That's a good practice that will support maintenance of our documentation and our code. So there we go, we got that. Next practice is consider using a structured content approach to your documentation. Structured content means breaking your content into the smallest reasonable semantic pieces, and then using those pieces to build your documentation. It's a way of thinking about content. You create a big organizational schema that lets you have a lot of reuse of individual parts. So for example, you could make a description for a thing, and then you could reuse that description. You could use it in your developer documentation, your user documentation. If you generate a big user manual or something, you could just push it into that. Where else it would make sense, and you'd never duplicate it. You just reuse it wherever you needed it. As a practice, structured content has a bunch of pros and advantages. So duplication and inconsistency are very unlikely. That's what it's designed actually to prevent, because you're single sourcing things and reusing things. And that's good. The holistic view of your documentation is sort of built into it. It's easier to update over time. It scales well, because if you have a good schema, the bigger things get, it won't become overwhelming, because you still understand the parts and so on. And because you're not duplicating even a little bit, even on those small pieces like the description and things, your overall data set is going to be much smaller than it would be if you're writing every document separately and so on. In fact, structured content is especially useful if you anticipate that you're going to have a very large repository at some point. Cons, disadvantages, weaknesses, is that it's very intentionally something that adds complexity, right? So there are good structured content tools that you can use to combine and recombine your content, but they themselves are also very complex tools. There's a real learning curve on that. You can see in the title there, I say DITA, that DITA is one such thing, and people love it and they hate it because of the complexity and the learning curve there. So yeah, quite often because of that complexity, another disadvantage is that your docs tool may be necessarily more separate from your code base. Not always, but in some cases, which can make it harder to maintain them in parallel than if they were closer together. And it can be very daunting because of the complexity. And I find not everyone's brain works in this way. It breaks things down in this way. So even if you don't go full on structured content tool, however, incorporating some of these principles into your documentation from the start can definitely support maintenance over time. So there's that. Another one would be automatic documentation generation. So that's where you have your code and the documentation for it is integrated right into the code and written in such a way that you run a generator that will then pull it out into documentation form. So you compile the code, you compile the documentation at the same time often. You can create relational diagrams and all sorts of things sort of automatically. There's all sorts of creative solutions that people have come up with. And I should say, in addition to these slides, I'll also be providing you at the end with a link to a document with all sorts of resources about all of these concepts. So if you're interested, you can check that out as well. So automatic documentation generation, what are the pros to that? Well, it's so much fun. If you're a developer and this is your thing, you will talk about it obsessively to everyone. You'll love it. And you'll talk about how great it is and how no one ever has to update the documentation separately ever again because, you know, you've solved everything with technology. And so it is self-sustaining for those people. It's easy to update. You just regenerate the docs when you make changes to the code, and they're right there, so it's easier to maintain that. If you are pulling your code samples directly out of the code, your code samples are likely to actually work, which would be exciting for some kinds of documentation. Of course, there are cons. The quality, once again, it's easy to keep the quality up if there's only one person doing it, but the more people you have involved, the more, it requires those people to very determinedly do all the right things every single time. There are linters and things like that that can help with that, but there's a learning curve here as well. And then also gaps are inevitable because your documentation will be very specific to the code you're looking at when you're creating it. You'll be missing those broader, how do all the things interrelate? What does it all mean and why? And of course, now you've got one more thing to maintain, not just your code and your documentation, but also your generator, that sort of thing. But as with structured content, automatic documentation generation can be a useful part of your documentation strategy. You may be sensing a theme here. So there we go. So next, I struggled to name this one something. I eventually decided to call it contributor consensus. And what I mean by this is agreement across your documentation contributors about what your overall documentation strategy is, what it includes, what your values are, what your standards are, and especially where does it live, how will it be published, who can add to it, that sort of thing. So all of those things can be useful as well, but agreement about what they are is the thing that I want to get at here. This is something you notice more in its absence than its presence. If you don't have it, you have problems. Sorry. But if you have it, you might not even notice that you have it because the problems don't come up. And this consensus is also something that needs to be maintained over time. It can't be negotiated once and that's it. You never need to talk about it again. No, consensus is buy-in from other people. It can't just be imposed. So as you add new contributors, you need to regain that consensus. As people forget, and people do forget, you need to regain that consensus. This is a very people-oriented one. If you don't have this, if you don't maintain it, then you'll find that people don't even know about your documentation. They're like, there's nothing. They don't know where to search. It's not as findable as you thought it was. They start up their own little repositories. There's a wiki over there. There's Confluence over there. The knowledge base is separate from those. There's a thing, you know, people have Word documents on their desktop that they're emailing to people. If you don't have this consensus, the whole thing starts to fall apart. If you have it, it's less scattered. It's easier to maintain and sustain over time. It's also likelier to stay within budget. It's a lot easier to have one thing and maintain one thing than to maintain all these separate things. And, you know, another pro is that we know that diversity of contributor, and that's why when I say consensus, part of what I want to get across is actually you do want to involve more people. You don't want it to be this one little niche thing that only you are doing documentation or only that person is doing documentation. Having more people there, having diversity of thought, we know that from the research that gives us better solutions to things and we'll have better outcomes. So that's a pro to that as well. And of course, the con is that it's actually really hard. It's hard to please everybody, and rebellion occurs unpredictably. Yeah, like everyone has strong opinions about where the documentation should be, what the right tool is, but they don't agree with each other. And they don't know that they don't agree because they all think there's only one obvious solution. So it's challenging, but I just wanted to make sure I talked about this one in particular. So that's that. The next one is good record keeping. Who knew? Good record keeping, it's very useful. And it can look any number of different ways. It's just that you need to have some record of what your documentation, where it is, those sorts of things. That's important. You need to document your documentation is sort of what I'm saying. So as an example, where I work, our documentation, which is documentation for systems we develop and create ourselves, and also for all sorts of software that we're using for our community, but we, you know, customize the documentation for our community, of course. It is all managed and recorded in a central location, but it is actually stored and served in a bunch of different places. It's because, boy, howdy, do we struggle with the consensus one that I just talked about. But every single resource has a record in our ITSM tool. And so here's a sample of what that looks like. So for every resource, it has a content owner, it has a backup content owner in case that person, the main one leaves or wins the lottery, what have you. It has a review date, it has a review cycle, it has all sorts of things. Audience, for example. It has a link to wherever that documentation is. And I'll come back to some of those concepts in a little bit, but we keep these records so we know where all the things are. So pros to having good records, well, you have that holistic view because you can see all of your documentation in all of the places that you have that it is, and so on. It's easier for you to identify your duplication and gaps and to make bigger changes. For example, we're about to change the way that our 50,000 students and 3,000 faculty and staff log into all of our systems. And because we have these records, I was able to generate a starting list of the documentation that we'll need to change to reflect that. So record keeping can turn up all sorts of advantages. Duplications, gaps, etc. And it can compensate for other lacks. Like it can, in our case, compensate for a lack of perfect consensus in some cases and things like that. But cons, record keeping is the easiest thing to drop. It's one more thing to maintain. And in my experience, the minute people get busy, they'll be like, yeah, I'll update that later. So it's very easy for them to walk away from it because it's more rewarding in the long term than in the short term, admittedly. It's not self-sustaining in that same way, but it's still highly recommended as a part of your overall strategy. And then here's another one. No biggie. Let's just have a dedicated documentation strategist or documentation team who is integrated with your dev team, right? Like not sitting separately, never included in all the things, but interacting with the developers, participating in scrums, all those sorts of things. which also, if you want to support your long-term maintenance, we also, why not also have the docs environment and processes integrated with the dev environment and processes if you can. That can be another thing to work on with that consensus piece. So pros, you're going to have that good holistic view of the documentation. You have people who are committed to doing this thing. This is their actual job. So presumably those people will be able to much more easily handle gaps, duplications, outdated info, and so on. They're a great support. Documentation people are a great support to devs, to user support teams, to users. Like they can be that. And of course, the con is money. Not every company has the money to do that. So, all right. That's some basic practices, and I've spent a fair bit of time on this, so I'm going to go a little quicker through the actual strategies themselves. But this is important groundwork, which is why I spent the time there. Next, I'm going to talk through just a couple of the sort of small scale, small budget kinds of options that you have. And the first one is everybody's favorite. It's a perennial favorite. It's called, let's go review all the docs. So this is a content audit, right? Like people are like, oh, we'll just look at all of the docs occasionally. People love this until they hate it. The pros are, I mean, you sure get that good holistic view of all the docs because you're looking at all of the documentation. And it is, when you look at all of it like that, it's easier to identify gaps, duplications, outdated content. But there are some major cons. First is it does not scale. It is time consuming and onerous if you have lots of documentation. If you have 20 documents, go ahead, do a content audit every so often, fine. But if you have 600, it's getting pretty challenging. If you have 10,000, no, my friend, you have met your doom. There's no way to do it. Because of that scaling problem, especially if you have larger repositories, it's much more likely to be interrupted, to be not finished. And although it seems like it would be easy to identify gaps, duplications, and outdated content, again, if the scale is very large, you can get really bogged down in it, and you might not actually get to do that part. You'll be lucky to get through to the end of, is all the content okay, before you even get to that analysis. Yeah, as I said, everyone loves it until they don't. That doesn't mean that it has no place. Like, it can be useful, it can have a place in the overall picture, but yeah, I have critique of that one. The next is something I'll call user triggered review or update. So here's a little screenshot of our knowledge base. Every article has a link at the bottom that just says, hey, report a problem with this article. And that means that if someone's looking at something and they see a problem, they can just immediately report it to us. You can do this lots of ways. And what's great about this is you're never going to waste work, right? You're only ever going to, if you do this, you know that you are actually addressing documentation that people want because they have identified a problem. They were trying to use it. So you're never wasting your time trying to guess at what people want, you know. It really helps you to prioritize your efforts. It can be cheap/free because it's reactive rather than having to have systems in place to be proactive about it. And the users themselves are telling you what needs to be done. So thanks, users. That was very generous of you. But the con is, of course, this gives you no holistic view of your documentation, no gaps or duplications or anything like that. Identification is going to happen. And it does not scale. This is actually pretty great at small scale, especially if you've got like a little open source project that you're maintaining off the side of your desk. You know, this can be a great way for that. But at the large scale, it doesn't do enough to address all of the problems that might come up. Next one is metrics directed review. So what I mean by that is you've got your Google Analytics report. So here's a Google Analytics report for our public facing knowledge base. It's actually from a couple of years ago now, but it's a good example. So we can see from here, these are the top hits in a period of time. The top 3 resources plus the homepage. These that's 37% of user attention. And so if you have 15 minutes and you go and you check this out and you look at those 3 articles in the homepage, you have addressed 37% of user attention. That was a really useful thing you just did there. Another thing that some people do is they actually look at the least viewed. I mean, these all have 1 view, but you'd also look for the ones that have 0 views. And they might just knock a few of those off the list. They delete them or hide them because they're not apparently serving an actual user need. And you can also look at what are the searches and then, direct your attention based on what are people searching for and make sure that the things people are searching for, they're finding and that those things are good. The pros are it really prioritizes efforts by user need again. It's efficient relatively. It can be used at any scale. Of course, if you delete things deliberately, you're deliberately creating gaps. That might not be good. It might be great, but it also might not be that good. There's no holistic view of everything, and it can't help you to identify duplications, et cetera, very easily. But it is useful. Then if we're talking, however, at a larger scale or a larger budget, larger period of time, et cetera, here are some strategies for that. The first I want to talk about is scheduled enforced review. And that is one of the things that we rely on most where I work. So because we have records and it relies on records, here's an example of, here's a screenshot from just this morning. In fact, we have 624 resources in there. I can see how many of them are past their review date, which right now is 29%, which is too high, but we had an error in our tool that actually meant people weren't seeing the review tasks. So we fixed that. It should be better soon. We try and keep it to about 90% reviewed is what we want to see. So people get a task assigned to them. It just goes in with all their other tasks that says, hey, you're in charge of this article, go check and make sure it's good to go. And then we can update it based on that. Now, the pros to this kind of thing are your outdated docs are rare, short-lived. You're going to eliminate gaps and duplications over time, although it's not perfectly holistic, but it is better than some. The workload is relatively manageable. Like if you had to review 60 articles today, that'd be too many. But if you have to, review 1 or 2 a week, that's doable. You can fit that in with your other work. And the cons are it requires a committed resource to support and enforce the review, and it's relying on good records. All right. And then the grand unified theory of everything. What I mean by that is something I've been sort of hinting at this whole time. It's the grand unified theory of docs maintenance is actually you need to use a bunch of these things, and a different selection of them is going to help you out there. So the strategies can reinforce each other. They can reward use, having good records, reward, the review works for that. Having good records in other ways, they just support each other. And the variety backfills the deficiencies. So if you have this system has these advantages, but these disadvantages, this one can sort of fill that in. And the work never ends. If you're a person who loves to work, you'll never run out of work if you combine multiple things. But of course, the con is that there is complexity and you need to navigate that complexity, partly by documenting that complexity, I would suggest. So that's a survey of what I think is the critical things you need to know about long-term maintenance. So there we go, we've done that. Summary and conclusions, and will I be able to restore your optimism and hope for the future? I know we're getting a little past the time, but I'll do my best. Scale and resources are important. When you start out, you don't need to have the biggest plan in the world. Not everyone can do that, but consider where you're going when you think about how you're doing it. There are plenty of strategies to choose from, but just start with what and who you have from where you are. Something is always better than nothing. There's always, if you have something, that's better than doing nothing at all. So keep going. Good luck. And these are the slides, and there's a link in the slides right there to go to that document that has all those resources. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great content and the great doodles. I really liked the doodles as well. So as we are waiting for questions, so if you have any questions, please, this is the time to ask them. But until we are waiting for questions, I see you have a beautiful mug, but we would like to send you another one with the Craft logo and your image also on it. So you will have another one.
Thanks.
So like we are going to mail this to you as a little thank you gift from the team. And also if you, I'm looking the Q&A, but there are no questions. So we are going to wait a few more sec, but if there are no questions, then we are going to share your presentation with the audience so they can go through them and check out again. Oh, we have a question, right? Okay, so from Gürkan, what is the best strategy to start writing documents on advanced projects with no documentation? So how to start?
Right. To start. I mean, that's documentation strategy more than maintenance strategy. That's a good question. Well, I mean, it would depend on the project. That's a hard question to answer just like that. If you, as I said, you know, consider how you might use some of those structured content principles. So think about what are the feature sets that you might want to be documenting, or what is the purpose of your documentation? Who is the audience? Who are the people who will be interested in it, who will be using it? What is their level of experience or knowledge? So just understand what your purpose is. Actually, that's a really good place to start, is to understand what it is you want to achieve by documenting something. And if you know that, then what you do to document it is going to sort of emerge from that. If you're documenting things just for other developers who are going to use your API or something like that, API documentation is its own thing, and there are actually some links about getting started with API documentation in that document, which is linked in the slides. So that's one type of documentation. If instead you're documenting something like a plugin that people will just use, but they might not be developers, then you're going to want to provide a different kind of documentation. It doesn't need to be the fanciest thing ever. There are lots of things that are convertible to other things. So sure, fire up a little wiki to start with. And then if later on you're like, oh, this doesn't really work, well, all of your content is there, and migrating the content from there is easier than some of the other challenges you might run into. Yeah, I mean, figure out what you're trying to do first, and then other things will emerge from that.
There's another one. Have you heard of a documentation strategy that made use of the big data people generating during development work?
I'm sorry,
have you heard of a documentation strategy that made use of the big data people generate during development work? Big data development.
I'll be honest, I don't have a lot of touch points with that.
Okay, let's see the next
sure.
one. What do you think of architecture decision records?
So like a log of decisions, like a decision log kind of idea, is that? Those are great. Yeah. I mean, who doesn't love to know why we made the decision we made, when we made it, who's involved? Those are great things. If it's about your architecture, yeah, it's about, or about any other thing. I think we generally err on the side of not writing enough things down because we understand it in the moment. We think we'll remember, but we won't remember. So I'm not sure if I've understood the question correctly, and I apologize if I've misunderstood it, but yeah.
Okay. Right, no more questions so far. So I think, and we are close to the end of this session. So once again, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to mail you the mug. Thanks again.